be seated. It is good to be with Antioch Church once again, not the least of which I still live in Pleasant Hill. Some of you don't know who I am, and I'll introduce myself quickly. My name is Jim Lorenz, and ministerial director. Most recently, I used to pastor the Pleasant Hill Church, and so this is a close church to me. Ministerial director, if you don't know what that is, that's kind of like a pastor to the pastors, and I'm actually working with you to help find a new pastor that we hope will be here soon. So keep us in prayer. I gotta say, it's also nice not only seeing faces I know, which is great, but you know, a half-hour drive sure beats the 3-hour drive I did last Sabbath. I was up north of Reading last Sabbath, so I enjoy coming to local churches. I want to start because it's the Christmas season. I want to start with a bit of Christmas trivia. How many wise men were there? So I'm hearing 3. And tradition, yes. And the real answer to this is we don't know. There are 3 gifts, but we've kind of filled in the gaps with tradition. In fact, we've even named the 3 wise men: Gaspar, Melchior, and let's see, Balthasar. There you go. So we've come up with 3 names. We just kind of filled in the gaps, and we've kind of made it these traditions. And so I'm wondering if we have built a tradition on some things that really has no real basis, are there other things in the Christmas nativity story that we have kind of built up that maybe, dare I say, we got wrong? Let me start with a story. It's one of those Christmas staples. The pageant, the Christmas pageant, and we even saw a version of it here with the puppets for the children's story. And these young children are acting out the nativity story. And we picked the story up at the no room at the inn scene. And the young Mary and Joseph, they walk up on stage to the inn door. The door opens brusquely, and 9-year-old Wally, who's been practicing his lines, brusquely asks, "What do you want?" And Joseph says, you know, they memorize these lines, right? "We seek lodging." "Seek it elsewhere," Wally says. "But, sir, we have tried everywhere, and we can find no place to sleep." "Go away," Wally responds. "But, sir, my wife is great with child. Don't you have a corner we can sleep in?" And here's where Wally starts to go off script. Actually, he doesn't even say anything. And the director on the side whispers, because, you know, as a parent, when you have seen your child pause up front and the parents start to kind of edge a little closer to the front of their seats, like, "Wally, we practiced this." And the person off the stage whispers, "No, be gone." And Wally kind of half-heartedly says, "No, be gone." So, according to the script, Mary and Joseph start to make their way off the stage. At this point, Wally goes totally off script and says, "Wait, don't go. You can have my room and I will sleep somewhere else." And we like this story, and perhaps you have heard this story before. And why do we like it? Because we find the Christmas story kind of mind-boggling. Where was the hospitality of everyone? And we wish there had been somebody like Wally there to have said, "You know what? You can have my place." In fact, we have built all kinds of Christmas traditions around the no room at the inn story. From Christmas pageants, I even did a drive-through nativity when I was at Roseville Church, where we had an inn with a donkey and who headbutted my daughter during the play. She was really small at the time. All these different types of things we put together, right? And some of you maybe are familiar with Los Posadas, the tradition. And if you're not a Spanish speaker, it means the inns, and it's a procession. It takes place in Mexico. Some cities in the U.S. even have it where people get together during certain nights leading up to Christmas, and you go from house to house, kind of like, no room at the inn. And we had built up all these traditions. But this led a Christian writer to say, isn't it ironic? Isn't it ironic that Christmas is about hospitality, but Jesus was born homeless? But I ask you the question, what if we have been telling the wrong story? What if the story is much different than we have been telling? We sing "We Three Kings" when we don't know how many kings there were. Maybe there's other things to this story. Let's start with this. Open your Bibles, and I want you to keep it open because I want you to be scripture-based. Luke 2, 3-5. Luke chapter 2 is the Christmas story. You're familiar with it? And we're going to start with verses 3-5. Luke 2, verses 3-5. And everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. You know the story. You've heard it many times. If I show you this picture, no captions, just silhouettes, everybody here knows what I'm showing you a picture of, right? We put it on Christmas cards. It's Mary and Joseph going through the desert on a donkey with no name. And this is a totally bogus picture. There's almost nothing right about this picture. Yes, there was Mary and Joseph, maybe a donkey, but nothing else in this picture is right. And yet, I didn't even have to tell you what it was, and you automatically knew what it was. And so I ask you the question, have we gotten a few things wrong? The first thing we overlook conveniently in a Christmas story, remember this picture here, is that Luke says everyone went to their own town to register. We act like Joseph and Mary were the only people going to be registered. This would also count any of Joseph's relatives traveling with them. The roads are going to look like this year's going from Las Vegas back to LA on I-15. Maybe some of you saw it in the news. Maybe some of you got stuck in traffic, holiday traffic after Thanksgiving, when everyone was on the road. Mary and Joseph were not alone. That is the first thing. And plus the fact, Mary's family is also of the lineage of David. They're going to be traveling to this neighborhood too. Are you beginning to pick up that maybe we have left a few things out of the story? And oh yeah, remember Elizabeth and Zechariah, Mary's cousin? They live in this neighborhood. So this is starting to make you question some of the things that you have been assuming about the story that you thought you knew. And all I'm trying to do is connect dots that you already know. But we've been telling the wrong story. And where do we get some of this wrong story about Mary and Joseph all by themselves going through the desert? And it's not desert, by the way, from Nazareth to Bethlehem. That's nothing that's wrong with that picture. Where do we get some of this stuff that we have assumed is fact? Well, comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James. a writer from around 200 AD, about the time that all kinds of stuff starts coming into the church, and the early church starts saying, hey, we're going to separate from our Jewish roots, and we're going to go a different direction. And oh, by the way, around that same time, we started picking up different Christmas traditions around the story. Mary and Joseph all by themselves, partially because the writer is not Jewish, does not understand Palestine, does not understand the Jewish culture. And it has been accepted as fact ever since. Even to the point where if I show you a picture of Mary and Joseph by themselves, you go, I know who that is. And it's wrong. So, let's talk about something else that's wrong with our story about Mary and Joseph. If you're an engaged Middle East couple, you're never alone by yourself. So there's no way Mary and Joseph are going to be alone. I mean, we act like they don't care about a pregnant woman. First of all, everyone is going to their hometown to be registered, which means Joseph's family is going with them. Mary's family is going to the same neighborhood, and they're going to be very concerned about a pregnant woman in that culture. Very concerned. So Mary's going to probably have sisters or maybe mom. Somebody's going with her to make sure she's going to be okay. So this fact of Mary and Joseph by themselves comes from a proto-evangelium of James, totally bogus. Let's go on with things that we don't get right with this story. Luke makes it clear that they're engaged, and so we know they're not going to be by themselves. But there is a word in this story that we often get wrong. But Rogelio, you got it right this morning, guy. Thank you. One of the few Bible versions that gets it right. Bethlehem, where it says there is no room in the inn. Did anybody hear what he said this morning? Because his version got it right. Did anybody else hear what he said? Because a lot of times in our minds we go, no room in the inn. That's actually not what he read this morning. He said there was no room in the guest room. You see, inns were not really a part of the Jewish culture. There was no Motel 6 in Bethlehem. Bethlehem's a small little town, population 300 to 500. Even if there was an inn, there were inns around. Luke tells a story about an inn, with the Good Samaritan story, but it's rare, and you're going to see why in a few moments, because it's just not part of the Jewish culture. And by the way, that person who goes to the inn is actually a Samaritan, right? So it's not really a big part of the Middle East culture. The second thing is, if Luke had meant inn, he would have used a different word like I just said. But the word he uses is kataluma, guest room. And this is a feature of Jewish homes. We see the same identical word. Luke uses it twice in his gospel, once in Luke 2 for the Nativity story, and once at the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, where they're looking for a kataluma, a guest room. We sometimes call the upper room. That's what they're looking for. And this has been a part of Jewish architecture since the time of David. Most houses from the time of David all the way to World War II consisted of 2 rooms, the average home. Now, if you're wealthy, you would have other rooms. But the average person would have 2 rooms in their house. They would have the guest room, kataluma, and the family room. And the family room, you got to understand how the family room is built. See those stairs down there? And you see where the animal room is? There is no wall between you and animal room. It is one big room. There happens to be a little bit, they're about 4 feet lower, the animals. So they don't just kind of, when you wake up in the morning, you don't have the donkey nuzzling you to wake up. They wanted to avoid that. So last thing you do at night is bring the animals into the animal section of this big room, and the first thing in the morning is you take them out. I had a friend from the Middle East, and he said, you know what? In Syria, where his cousin is, he goes, my cousin has a house just like this. And this style of house goes back to the time of David. But the writer of the Proto-Evangelium of James wasn't Jewish. He didn't understand the culture. And so he says it's something else. He makes it an inn, like a Motel 6. So Mary would not have given birth in a stable. They're saying the guest room was taken. Maybe one of Joseph's relatives or some other relative that's older. Older gets more respect. An older family member is in the guest room. Remember, everybody's there. House is full, like, your houses are full for the holidays. So somebody's already in the guest room. So Mary gives birth in the family room. And they pull the manger that is right there with the animals up into the family room and lay Jesus in it. That is the Nativity story. So, I want you to connect another dot that you already know. Because the way we tell this story is that Mary and Joseph are refugees to Bethlehem and don't know anybody. We forget that Joseph's related to half the village. And we forget what Middle Eastern hospitality is about. Randy Yonker, who's an Adventist archaeologist, tells this story that he was in the Middle East, he was on a dig, an archaeological site, and between the dig site and where they were camping was a number of miles that they had to go back and forth across. And in this place, they were in the desert. And he said the challenge was the Bedouin camps. Now, if some of you have been to the Middle East, you've seen Bedouin camps with their black tents. And hospitality is it is super important. And so every time they came across a Bedouin camp, if they drove by it, the father, the head of the camp, would come out and want them to come in and have tea. And it's not, here's your tea, gulp it down. No, this is going to take at least probably 3 cups of tea and an hour. It's hospitality. It's not rushed. And Randy's going, I only have a few weeks on this dig site, and half my day is taken drinking tea. I've got to speed things up. And so he tells his driver, remember, they're going through the desert. There's no roads here on a 4x4. They're not going fast. But he tells his driver, we're going to skip all the Bedouin camps. If we see them in the distance, we're going to drive around them. They're fairly successful until they crest one hill. The day before, that camp had not been there, but today it is. And Randy tells his driver, keep on going. The Bedouin father comes jetting out of the camp, out of the tent, trying to flag them down. And Randy says, keep on driving. He calls his son, bring the tea set. So the son brings the tea set, running beside the Jeep. The father is trying to pour tea as he's running, trying to hand it to Randy in the Jeep. At that point, Randy says, I can't do this to him anymore. Stop, we'll have tea. We're going to kill another hour. But that's Bedouin hospitality. That is Middle Eastern hospitality. But that is not the story we tell. We take Mary and Joseph out of their Middle Eastern culture, put them in a culture that is more closely assigned to our own, but we defeat what the Bible story is about. We're not telling the Bible story most of the time when we tell the Nativity story because we've divorced it from its culture. It is a totally different story. See, hospitality in the ancient world was a matter of life and death, and so it became so super important. That's why Middle Eastern hospitality is so renowned, so well known. Because if you're in a desert, you're relying that when you get to a camp that they're going to help you. or another town. And so they actually had this code. There's an invitation, there's screening, there's provision, and departure. Invitation. If you're a stranger, you come up to the city gates, you wait outside, somebody is going to come out and invite you in. You just come out to the city gates and wait. Part of the screening is going to be they want to make sure you're not some enemy or somebody like that. Maybe you have a letter that says, from somebody who's well-known or important, saying this person's okay, you can trust them, please take care of them. The provisions, you're going to wash their feet, or provide water so they can wash their feet, you're going to provide some food, and a place to sleep. Probably in your kataluma, right? And then departure. They can only stay for 2 days. Guests can only stay. And some of you are going, that's the ticket with the holidays. Only 2 days. And that's how it works. But it shows up in the Bible in places that you have read before, but you have not paid attention to. Look at Genesis 19, 1-3 with Sodom and Lot. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city, where you expect strangers to come, right? And when he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet, spend the night, and then go your way in the morning, early in the morning." So he's not saying, hey, stay a week with me. No, this is just part of Middle Eastern hospitality. This is a common thing to do. No, they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." Why? Because there is no Motel 6 there, right? It's not a part of the culture. But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him. And he entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. This is typical of Middle Eastern hospitality. He doesn't know these people from Adam. They are strangers. But this is what you do in the Middle East. You take care of traveling strangers. And this is the story we need to make sure that we are talking about. Have you ever snuck in to a town where you have family and you didn't tell them you were there, that you were coming? Because you're going, I only have so much time, and, we're going to see them in a month. I don't need to contact them this time. And then family finds out, and they're offended, right? Okay, take that offense and multiply it by 10. If Joseph and Mary had come to Bethlehem and not contacted relatives, everybody would have been ashamed. I mean, it would have been a big shame thing. What? You can't stay with us? What, we're not good enough for you? Now, this is the world they're in. They were obligated to stay with family. Otherwise, it's a huge shame on the family. They're not looking for a motel. They're just going to Bethlehem. That is home. In fact, here's something that's interesting. Do you know what the Latin is of Cataluma for guest room? Hospitium, from which we get our English word hospitality. That's because this is their culture. Hospitality is part of their culture. And yet we have made Mary and Joseph's story about refugees who don't know anybody. They're by themselves. Poor Mary is giving birth with no one around. They are strangers in a strange land. That is so far from the truth. Has no bearing in the story. When I was in the 3rd grade, I was given this writing assignment. And this writing assignment was a creative writing assignment. So if we have some teachers here, you know the type of assignments you give. And we were to write about the place anywhere in the world that we wanted to live and why. And so my imagination went wild. I mean, I can live anywhere in the world? All right. So my 3rd grader mind, I started writing, and I wrote. Do you want to know where I decided I wanted to live? I could pick anywhere in the world where I wanted to live. I wanted to live in Oklahoma. Now, I know some of you said, wow. As an adult, I have been to Oklahoma. I've been to Oklahoma many times. I've been back. With apologies to Oklahoma, I don't think God intended people to live in Oklahoma. I've still got family there. I mean, that place, worst winters, worst summers. I mean, I could go on and on. But the reason I wanted to be there was family. I mean, my dad, we got a ton of relatives. I mean, it's like you couldn't go downtown Little Shattuck, Oklahoma without being related to somebody or my dad knowing them. And the same with the church. I didn't know everybody in church. I knew very few people in church. I just knew as a little kid I was related to like half of them somehow. I didn't even know what the family connections were. And even the others, everybody, I mean, it was the most fantastic church for me as a little kid to go into because it was like, I didn't have to know them. They knew me. And it was just like walking in as like, little Jimmy, you're here. We're so glad you're here. And I'm like, I don't know who you are, but this is great. And then my granny's cooking, all the relatives, this common bond that we had. Some of you remember the Olive Garden slogan, when you're here, you're family. And that's what I felt when I was in Shattuck, Oklahoma, and that's why my little third grader self said that is the ideal place to live. All Joseph has to do when he goes to Bethlehem is to say, I am Joseph, son of Heli, son of Matat, son of Levi, and all the doors of Bethlehem open to him. When he's in Bethlehem, he is family and he is home. The Nativity story is really about hospitality. And it's a story we need to tell. And not tell a westernized version that has no bearing in the biblical story. Because somebody from the Middle East is going to say, I have no idea what that story's about, because that's not my culture. Listen to Hebrews 13:2. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. The New Testament takes this cultural norm and takes it to a new level and says, it's not just practical. Hospitality is not just for survival. It's now spiritual. Because this story is recalling, if you haven't already caught the allusion, to when Abraham, another hospitality story, is sitting in his tent and he sees strangers walking by and he runs out to them and says, come into my tent and be refreshed. Like you do in the Middle East. And the writer of Hebrews is saying this is spiritual. Because recall the Abraham story, he even entertained God. Do you remember what Jesus said when he preached in Matthew 25? When he says, if you've done it to one of the least of these, my brothers or sisters, you've done it unto me. Do you remember what he was actually referencing? I'll clue you in. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Hospitality is not just a nice thing you do. It is a spiritual service that we do. Let's connect the dots. I fed you the first part of Hebrews 13. Let's look at the last part. And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. You and I are strangers in this world. We do not have a city yet. And yet Jesus came and died. The Christmas story is about Jesus coming so that we will be strangers no more. Amen. The Christmas story, the Nativity story, is about eternal hospitality. Amen. And we, you and I, are invited to participate in this. Amen. It cost Christ everything. And we are invited to participate in this hospitality. A British doctor was going back into a room to meet with Doris. Doris is 82 years old. Doris had an interesting history that every time they went to discharge her, Doris had some other symptom. They had x-rayed her. They had done blood samples. They had done everything to Doris. In fact, the chart read this. Yesterday it was her arm that was hurting. Before that it was her hip. Truth is, Doris is an incredibly healthy 82-year-old. We can't find anything. I have no doubt it will be the same today. So when the x-rays came back normal, the doctor came to Doris and said, Doris, we're going to have to follow the plan that we talked about. We're going to need to discharge you. Doris is quiet. Finally, she says, Doctor, I am so lonely. There are so many hours in the day. Can you cure my loneliness? Our world has been experiencing pandemics. But there is a pandemic of loneliness in our world too, especially in the shadow of COVID. We've had people being more disconnected for whatever reason. Maybe it's politics, maybe it's a fear of the disease, all these different reasons, but we have become less connected. And as a result, people have become more lonely. The Antioch church is in Antioch for a reason. Hospitality. Connected to eternal hospitality. This is the Christmas story. We are called to the loneliness, to address the loneliness of this world. I want to share with you just a couple of brief things that you can do to address the loneliness. One is invite people into your space. It doesn't need to be fancy. I remember when I was a seminary student, a bachelor seminary student, after church one day, a woman in the church invited several of us over to her house for soup and salad. It was not fancy. And yet, that was one of the most special meals I had. Because we were together. Hospitality. You don't know how important that can be. Invite your friends and colleagues into your spiritual space, your spiritual home, at the right time. Don't just force things, kind of do the red light, green light, yellow light thing. If it's red and they just seem hostile to it, don't push it, just wait. Let the Holy Spirit work on them. If they seem open, you can start, yellow light, start broaching stuff, and if it's green, go for it. Be intelligent as you witness. Eat with other Christians. There's something about eating with fellow Christians that we have in the Bible. I know with COVID it's been tough. And with all these illnesses going around. But just inviting people over, just being together with people. Something happens over food. And the last thing is listen. One of the greatest gifts we can give people that people are super stingy with is listening. We're so busy talking, we don't listen. And if you listen, then you start hearing ways that you can minister to these people. And sometimes one of the greatest gifts you can give somebody is to let them be heard. They just want to be heard. Somebody care. And as a church, there should be no strangers in this church. Hospitality begins here. No strangers. And that means it's not just the greeter's job out there. It's not just the elder's job. It's not just the deacon's job. It's everyone's job. And it doesn't mean we say, hey, stand up and greet one another. I hate to tell you this, guests hate that. But if you come up to them and just say, hey, my name's Jim. Nice to meet you. Glad you're here today. Don't let people be strangers here. And secondly, find a way to serve in your church. And maybe it's just doing that. Maybe you're the warm person in this church that goes around and makes sure there aren't strangers in this church. But there's other ways to serve in church too, and serve in your community. This is all about Christian hospitality. One last thing that hospitality does, it gets us off of ourselves. In our TikTok influencer culture, we are so selfied. You know, we're always like, hey, it's all about me. Hospitality, though, is not about me, unless you're Martha Stewart. But it should not be about you. It should be about someone else. Hospitality is not only good for somebody else, it's also good for you emotionally. We could spend the rest of our time talking about the emotional benefit you get by serving somebody else. I want to finish with a Christmas story. And this one actually takes place in what the writer describes as a picturesque New England town. She says the church could have been on a postcard. And it's Christmas Eve. They had just finished the Christmas Eve service. They're headed home. And things had gone amazingly well. People had been pretty close to being on key during the songs. People had remembered most of the lines during the Christmas play. And Vicki Austin, who had directed it, is headed home with her 4 children and her father. Her husband is and they called it villages back there. It's a New England thing, you know. He's the village doctor. And so they're headed home in their station wagon. And she's just kind of relaxing, like, whew, that's done. You know, now we can have Christmas. And so they get home, and as you get up to their house, and the station wagon lights shine on the house, the front door, they see a pile of clothes in front of the front door. And we didn't leave that there. And then a pile of clothes moves, and they see a face with a pile of clothes. It's Evie. Evie. See, Evie had been their favorite babysitter, but 2 years ago when she was 16, she had left, and they hadn't seen her since. And so they're going, Evie, and they see Evie's got kind of a tear-stained face, and they're going, what's the matter? And Evie just holds out her arms, almost childlike, to Vicky and says, Mom kicked me out. She invites Evie in. Come on in, Evie. Bundles her into the house. They start plying her with soup and sandwiches, and Evie's just beginning to tell the story of how she got kicked out. Evie takes off her jacket, and she's obviously pregnant. Vicky can't help but notice. And she says, yeah, that's why Mom kicked me out. At about that moment, in the midst of this story, all of a sudden you hear John, their oldest child, yell from the living room. Apparently the dog, while they'd been at the Christmas pageant or play, Christmas Eve service, had decided to unwrap all their gifts. Christmas is beginning to go off schedule at this point. At this point, the eldest child declares Christmas ruined. And as they're getting more information from Evie, and she's telling them about how when she babysat for them, she wanted the love that she saw in this house. And so she goes looking for it. Unfortunately, in the wrong places. She thought she found it in a boy named Billy, and well, one thing led to another, and she's pregnant, and he's not around. And about that moment, as again they get an interruption, there's a phone call. Eugenia, their neighbor, her oven has quit. Can she come over and use one of the Austin's ovens to cook her turkey? Sure, come on over. And then the eldest child again says, just a typical Austin Christmas. But hold that thought for a second. A typical Austin Christmas, because sometimes we get so protective of our holidays, we say, you know what, this is my time, my time. But I think what's so phenomenal about this story is that line right there, a typical Austin Christmas. A homeless girl, a neighbor in need. And then there's the phone call from Wally, the husband, the doctor. He says, I got to bring somebody home. Vicky's like, sure, we'll figure it out. They're rearranging beds in the house, where people are going to sleep. Turns out he brings a young woman, Maria, with him. Her husband had been killed 2 weeks ago in a car accident. She'd been in the hospital since with her toddler, but had no place to go on Christmas Eve, and so he said, hey, come home with us. But that thing of a typical Austin Christmas that really catches what Christmas is about: hospitality. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. As you and I recall the Christmas story, as we recall the grand hospitality of Jesus, so that you and I will have an eternal home, may that spur us to hospitality in our church, in our homes, in our neighborhoods. As we think about this, I want to leave you with a blessing. We might be saying, this sounds hard. And it may be. What Christ did wasn't easy, and he's inviting us to come and share in that. So I'm going to leave you with a blessing from Paul. Now unto him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. Amen. Merry Christmas.